Let us hear your word, that we may know your truth and follow your ways. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. We are in chapter 8 of the story. And the battles that began with Joshua continue with the Israelites, conquering and taking possession of the land that God had promised their ancestors. This is the time of the Judges. And it covers about a 300-year period that began sometime after Joshua's death, but before the rise of the monarchy. The judges were not judicial leaders, they were military leaders, anointed by God to deliver or save Israel from their enemies. Some of the judges were deeply flawed individuals, chosen to save a deeply flawed nation. The book of Judges in the Old Testament is about God's relationship with Israel. When the nation repeatedly disregarded God's demand for obedience and holiness, God was faced with a huge dilemma. Does God overlook their sin, or does God break the promises that were made to their ancestors? Fortunately for the Israelites, God refused to break the covenant. But God insisted that they live in obedience and faith in order to obtain their inheritance. Following Joshua's death, the people began to stray from God. They made significant mistakes when they settled into the cities they took possession of. Instead of driving out the city's inhabitants, the Israelites disregarded God's rules and obligations of living in community, and instead they imitated the wicked and evil ways of the city's inhabitants. On page 107 in the story, we read, "The people, forgetting their special relationship to God, began to adapt to the surrounding cultures." In what ways are we influenced by our culture instead of us influencing society? The people also turned away from God to worship other gods, which led to oppression and persecution from their enemies. Their children neither knew God nor knew what God had done for their ancestors. The nation had forgotten God completely. In anger and in sorrow, God told the people, "I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I had promised your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant for you. For your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. Tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed my command. See what you have done. So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become adversaries to you, and their gods shall be a snare to you." When the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the Israelites, the people lifted up their voices and wept. What are you supposed to do with adult children who refuse to abide by the family rules and guidelines? Although you want to protect them, at some point you make a decision to step back and let them suffer the consequences of their unwise decisions and poor behaviors. That's what God did with the Israelites. When they were unfaithful and disobedient, God stepped back, leaving them to their own devices. Israel had been in Canaan for hundreds of years. God had provided them with everything they could possibly need to be the great and holy nation God had envisioned. Yet time after time, they disobeyed God's first commandment: do not have any other gods before me. Frequently, they worshiped every god except the God of their ancestors. And each time they strayed from God, it resulted in bondage and oppression. When a nation forgets God and worships other gods, chaos and evil abound. Following years of oppression, the Israelites would cry out to God in distress, and each time God heard their cries and groaning, God would be moved with pity and would raise up a judge to deliver them from their enemies. Judges like Gideon, Deborah, and Samson, and they would lead their people into battle. After defeating their adversaries, the nation of Israel would experience years of rest. But once the judge died, the people would resort back to their old wicked ways. With each subsequent judge, the nation's behavior worsened, each generation persisting in a downward spiral. During this period of judges, the Israelites were oppressed by at least 6 different countries. And when you read the book of Judges, you'll see this cyclical theme. Israel is unfaithful to God. Israel is oppressed by her enemies. Israel repents and turns back to God, and they cry out to God in distress. God raises up a deliverer, a judge empowered by God's Spirit. The nation experiences a time of peace. The judge dies. Israel is unfaithful to God. Israel is oppressed by her enemies. And the cycle continues. The good news for the Israelites and for us is that it doesn't matter how often we turn away from God. It doesn't matter how long we have been estranged from God. God waits patiently for us to return. And whenever God hears our cries, in mercy and compassionate love, God sends us a deliverer, Jesus Christ, to save us. Of the many deliverers, the many judges that God raised up, one was Gideon. Gideon worked on the family farm, and one day God came to him and said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." To which feisty little Gideon replied, "If the Lord is with us, then why has all of this happened to us? The Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hands of Midian." Although it was the Israelites who abandoned God in their current oppressive situation, they were unable to see how their sin played a role in their situation. God told Gideon, "Go, save Israel." I can imagine Gideon's shock and disbelief as he counters, "How can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest of all, and I am the least in my family." Gideon couldn't believe that God would choose him. But God gave him what seemed like an impossible mission: save Israel. Gideon challenged God with an equally ridiculous request. If God was serious about this, then God needed to prove to Gideon that it really was God speaking to him. And when God did what Gideon asked, he takes 300 of his men, goes in and destroys the Midianite army consisting of 200,000. Sounds pretty unbelievable, doesn't it? But if it hadn't turned out that way, if it hadn't been that way, then the Israelites would have taken credit for the win. They would have been boastful and prideful in their successes, chalking them up to their own skills and abilities rather than giving credit to God. by 300 men destroying 200,000, it was clear to both the army and to the inhabitants of the land that their salvation came from God. The author of the story, Randy Frazee, writes, "Today, it's difficult for followers of God to remain focused on God when everything is going right. For some reason, in times of prosperity and abundance, we often grow distant or ignore God completely, feeling self-sufficient in our temporary happiness. Conversely, some of the most inspiring stories of devotion to God come from the poorest and most oppressed communities of faithful Christians. Although the forms of oppression are different today than they were during the time of the judges, the church is used by God to free people from oppression and bondage in whatever forms they present themselves. People are oppressed by poverty, addictions, domestic violence, racism, sexism, and human trafficking right here in Kyle, Texas. But God hears the cries of the people and raises up deliverers to save them from their bondage. Paul talked briefly about the ramp project yesterday. And it's not a simple mission project. It's an example of deliverance. There are people who are confined to their homes, isolated because of their physical limitations and lack of resources. Having a ramp gives them freedom. Freedom to leave when they want. Freedom to visit family and friends. Freedom to worship. Freedom to go to the grocery store, work, doctor's appointments, or simply sit outside enjoying God's beautiful creation. God continues to raise up leaders, deliverers for tasks such as those. And God has raised up Kyle United Methodist Church for those tasks. Like Gideon, we sometimes can't believe that God would choose us to do that work. Surely God is mistaken. Us? We are not mighty warriors. But instead of asking that question that Gideon asked, how can this church save Kyle? We're small. We don't have the resources. We're young. We're old. Unskilled. Busy. Tired. The question we ought to be asking is not how can this church save Kyle, but how is God saving Kyle through this church? Let us pray. Oh God, you created the world and all that is in it, blessing every part of creation with love. You delivered us from bondage and called us into witness and service. Clear our minds of all the distractions which would draw us away from you. Open our hearts and spirits, letting your healing, empowering love flow in. Prepare us to be witnesses to your mercy and grace, using the gifts with which you have blessed us to your service. It's in the name of your Son, our deliverer, our Savior, Jesus Christ.
I need some helpers to help me